Howdy. I love saying that, being back here at Texas A&M. Good evening to all, and welcome here to the auditorium as we're going to have a great event tonight. I want to welcome Senator Rob Portman, and there'll be a longer introduction here in just a minute. But just a big thank you here to ConocoPhillips for sponsoring the White House Lecture Series. We have many distinguished guests here, but I especially want to welcome Rob Mosbacher Jr., as well as his wife, Caroline Barco, former Colombian foreign minister and ambassador to the U.S. Welcome. President and Mrs. Welsh. Let's give a round of applause. President Mark Welsh of Texas A&M and his wonderful wife, Betty. Sir, ma'am, welcome. Secretary Andy Card and his wonderful wife, Kathleen, welcome. And Gene Becker, former Chief of Staff to President George H.W. Bush and a member of our family here always. Welcome, Gene. There are many, many others here, members of the Bush School Advisory Board, friends of the Bush School, senior alumni, and just friends all around. I welcome all of you and thank you for your support as we endeavor to get the next generation of leaders ready here at the Bush School of Government Public Service. Let's give all of you a big round of applause. Tonight we're going to be talking about how to bridge partisan divide, and I can't think of a better speaker to do that than Senator Portman. So without further ado, I'm going to turn the mic over to Raymond Robertson, who is director of the Mosbacher Institute and one of our best scholars on economics and somebody who knows a lot about this area, and I'm going to turn it over to him for an introduction more thoroughly for Senator Portman. Raymond, over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Dean Sherman, for that introduction. I have to tell you that me and my colleagues and so many of us are so delighted to have you in charge and at the helm. It's really been an honor. I know that it's very difficult to fill Mark Welch's shoes, as we all know, and we're sad to lose him, but obviously having you here is really wonderful for all of us, and we appreciate the inspiration and the energy and the direction that you bring, so thank you very much. Howdy. I'm really honored to be here tonight to introduce our very distinguished guest, the Honorable Rob Portman, who's going to be sharing his thoughts with us about bipartisanship. I know all of you have seen the news, and as something that's very, very real for all of us, and I think it's a critical issue, and I'm very excited to be sharing some of these ideas with the Senator. I don't know how many of you know his background, but he really has an entire lifetime of public service, very much in the tradition of George H.W. Bush's claim for us, or directive, that public service is a noble calling. He was born and raised in Cincinnati, Ohio, and he grew up in a small business family where he learned the value of hard work, leadership, and fiscal responsibility, working for his father's forklift truck dealership. He went on then to leave the business for a while to become a lawyer and representing his father's business and other small businesses throughout the state. In 1993, he was first elected to Congress. His career in public service spanned 3 decades, including service in 2 very distinguished presidential administrations, 2 terms in the United States Senate, and 6 terms in the U.S. House of Representatives. In the George W. Bush administration, he served as the Director of Office of Management and Budget and as the United States Trade Representative. Under President George H.W. Bush, he served as Associate Counsel and Director of Legislative Affairs, and I'm looking forward to hearing some of his stories about the President in just a few moments. But he really set himself apart very early on for his results-oriented approach. He has a very keen eye for policymaking, work ethic, and the ability to work across the aisle to find bipartisan solutions to the problems that families throughout the country, but especially in Ohio, would face. Portman had more than 220 bills signed into law by Presidents Biden, Trump, and Obama during his 12-year tenure in the Senate. He served as the lead Republican negotiator in the bipartisan infrastructure law that will dramatically improve our nation's infrastructure. He played a key role in U.S. foreign policy throughout his seat on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and as a co-chair and founder of the Senate Ukraine Caucus. In his post-Senate career, he's now serving as a senior fellow for the American Enterprise Institute and has founded the Portman Center for the Policy Solutions at the University of Cincinnati, which is designed to bring people together to find very practical solutions for the problems that we face. Senator Portman and his wife Jane still live in Cincinnati now and have 3 adult children, Jed, Will, and Sally. And I hope that you will all please join me in giving a warm Aggie welcome to Senator Rob Portman. Thank you very much. You're the guest. I can project before the microphones get, and I want to just draw your attention to the programs. The programs have a QR code on them, which, if technology is cooperative, will allow you to enter in a question for the senator that will hopefully be transmitted to my phone after so when I'm looking at my phone, I'm not checking my stocks, okay? I'm just letting you know, or messages from my mom, okay?
You're not joking about that.
I am not. So, great. So having said that, Senator Portman has decided to just forego the opportunity to give you direct marks, and he's opted instead to just have a conversation. And I thank you for that, because I have to tell you, for months I've been looking forward to having a conversation with you, because you're someone whose career has not only inspired me, but also really literally millions of Americans, and having you here is really an honor. I mentioned that you started your career in Ohio, and obviously you grew up, and you had mentioned that your early political ideas were heavily formed by really your family experience, right? So especially both your parents, your father and your mother. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, sure. First, it's great to be here in Aggie land, and howdy.
Howdy.
I have a son, Jed, who is our oldest, who was an Aggie student for a while. He had met a girl the summer before working on a ranch. He came to Texas A&M to become a ranch manager, and then he followed her to New York instead. And the rest is history. They broke up, by the way. And he kicks himself that he didn't stay in Aggie land. But I knew a lot about Aggie land because I worked in the first Bush White House for a guy named Fred McClure, some of you may know. Fred? Because one of those jobs, I was associate counsel to President Bush. He gave me my start in a very direct way, which is he gave me a job after the campaign. But also, he gave me the inspiration to serve. You know, he just was the most decent, honorable guy I've ever known in public service. And you're right, it is a noble calling if you do it right. And he showed us all how you can do it right. And so without him, I certainly wouldn't be here, and I certainly wouldn't have had those great 30 years of public service. I also served under Andy Card, because Andy Card was in the Bush White House as well, and Secretary Card, I should say. And so I got to work with him in various capacities. And then Gene Becker, of course, was everything to Barbara and George Bush, including Chief of Staff. And those of you who haven't read her book before, you can get it. Just dial 1-800. Sorry. But Character Matters is a fun book. And in that book, she has vignettes. Many of you have read it, I suppose, from various members of the Bush administration. And I was one of them who she called. I gave her about 40 pages. She took about 1 page. So she kept out the best part. But I talked about some tough decisions he had made, and I had been there to witness. And you know, we maybe talk about that later as you get into the debt and deficit. But he really cared about those things and thought that it was worth risking his political future for it. And that was not just courageous, but classic George Bush, you know, in his own humble way. I sat in on meetings in the cabinet room with members of Congress. Fred was there as well. We got to hear a lot of very interesting conversations, including him saying to members of Congress things like, you know what, just blame it on me when you go home and people get mad at you if you vote for this thing. You know, this is about our country. This is bigger than me. And it's not about politics for me, and I understand if you can't be with me. I mean, he was just very humble and in the end very persuasive. It probably was the reason he was not reelected. I believe it was. And by the way, it was Republicans who first went after him on it, and then George Mitchell picked up on it, the Democrats, and so he was not reelected. But he did what he thought was the right thing. And That decision, which was back in 1990, ended up being the reason we got to a balanced budget at the end of that decade. Because he set in place spending restraints, including on Medicare. Imagine that today. That led to the ability to reduce spending enough with a growing economy that he also was instrumental in, to be able to get to a balanced budget in 1999 and 2000. So people forget that sometimes, that he laid the foundation for a big improvement in our nation's finances and our fiscal condition. I haven't answered your question yet.
But you've answered all the other ones I was going to ask, so that's fine.
So I grew up in a small business family, and you're right, my values were kind of honed then. I mean, my dad risked everything when he was about 40 years old, and he had a job as a salesman, he had a commission, he had health care, and he gave it all up to start his own little business. My mom was the bookkeeper. No health care, which my mom reminded him of when she quit after she had an injury and couldn't find any health care. So, but it was that small business, entrepreneurship. And my dad was a World War II vet, and I got early on. I was focused on how do you help other people achieve their American dream, because I saw how it happened with him, and I saw how he treated his employees and how they in turn treated him. And the company went on to be about 350 people, which is big for a lift truck distributorship. My brother took it over. I went on the dark side and became a lawyer. And then elected official next to George Bush. But anyway, that was sort of my beginning of thinking this stuff matters, taxes, regulations, healthcare, and how do you keep that American dream alive? And in the context of helping people, also being sure that the entrepreneurial spirit isn't lost in our country. So that continues to be something I worry about and think about a lot, and kind of got me started. My mom, on the other hand, she was, probably the inspiration in terms of the public service. My dad thought I was crazy, getting into first law and then politics. It was like a double whammy. By the end of his life, he'd become a believer because, he saw how you can make a difference in things like tax reform, and again, regulatory relief and things like that help small businesses. But my mom had that spirit of public service, and my first memory of wanting to be in public service when I was about 9 years old. I'm driving with my mom, and there were potholes in the road. And I said to my mother, who later told me, I didn't remember this, she said, "Robbie, you said to me, someday I want to fix those potholes." And I've spent 30 years in public service, and I can't fix a damn pothole. When you're a senator, you can't do much about potholes. That's why I did the infrastructure bill, thinking maybe this will help,
Finally.
Anyway. So they both had an influence on me.
Mm-hmm. And when you then went to Washington, you mentioned that you obviously got your start by George H.W. Bush gave you this job, right? But what was it like meeting him at first? Like, tell us some about that experience and your personal interaction.
I'm going to say some things here I probably shouldn't, but that's okay, right, Gene? So the first time I met him, it was on Capitol Hill, and it was about 1978, maybe. So it was before he ran for president, but he was thinking about it. So he was up on Capitol Hill for a reception. I don't know if I ever told you this, Fred, but I remember him having the big George Bush name thing, and there was a photo taken of the two of us, and I got to find out. I had kind of long hair, I remember. But I thought, he's a nice guy, but kind of goofy, Tall, gangly guy, and just too friendly, But Gene's laughing. But I just thought, he's a really friendly guy. He's too friendly and too outgoing and too genial to be, a politician. And then when he ran for president, I got to know him better because I was a volunteer for him. I was an advance person. For those of you who've done advance work, you go out ahead of the president or vice president or candidate and do work for him. And when he was vice president, I had the honor to go with him to France. Not with him, I went ahead of him to France and to China. And so I got some great experiences with him and saw him in action. And, he was the ultimate diplomat. Ambassador, you know that from his background. When he ran for president, you remember, he said, "I'm going to be called Ambassador Bush. That's what we'll call me." And then the political consultants got a hold and said, "No, nobody likes ambassadors in the political world. In Ohio, saying ambassador is not great." But he really was an ambassador his whole life for our great country, and really believed in the country, and wanted to figure out how to bring countries together as allies. And so I saw that about him. I also would jog with him. I jogged with him in the ambassador's residence in Paris, and that little track behind it. And he was a very competitive guy, as some of you know. And Gene's book, I think, talks about this a lot. But he wouldn't let you win if you were jogging with him. It's like he'd elbow you out, if you come around. Just sort of stay back. I used to play tennis on the White House tennis courts when I was in the Bush administration. When I was associate counsel for the president, I wasn't permitted to because I didn't have a high enough ranking. When Fred hired me over in the Legislative Affairs Office, I finally got to use the tennis court. That's why I took the job, Fred. So we'd be out there playing tennis in the evening, and all of a sudden we'd look up, and there he was. He was out wandering around with the dogs. 2 dogs at the time, I think. One might have been Millie. These were English Spaniels. And it was classic George Bush. He had on his suit pants still, and then he had on a jacket, and the jacket would be a jacket that somebody had given him. And, it had a patch on it of some kind of thing. And then he had on a cap, and the cap was, didn't match the jacket, didn't match the, anything. And some big shoes, and he'd be just out wandering around. He was very comfortable in who he was. He didn't get gussied up, and didn't really care how he looked because he knew who he was. That was my impression. He called himself the ranking committee. So again, very competitive. He would come down and watch us play tennis. I was playing with Joe Hagan, who's some of you know. And of course, we're so damn nervous, at least I was missing, not even hitting the ball. It's like, there's the vice president, the president of the United States, and we're playing tennis. He'd go, you got to work on that serve, Portman. I'm the ranking committee, and you're not doing too well here. But great sense of humor. Today I had a driver in Houston to go from the airport to a meeting, and he said, "Where are you going?" I said, "I'm going to the George H.W. Bush Library." He said, "Oh, I got to meet him." This guy, his mom is from Nicaragua, his dad is from Cuba. You imagine he's pretty conservative, good Republican. And he said, "I just loved him. I got to meet him a couple times." And he'd go to Astros games after he was president. And he said, the thing about him is he was so down to earth, and he was so funny. He said, "Did you know that he went skydiving?" He was in his 80s. I said, "Yeah, I heard about that." I actually witnessed it. But it was really nice to hear this guy, whose parents were both immigrants to this country, and he's a driver, and he's just saying, "I love that man. He was just so down to earth." And that's the George Bush that I, again, saw, and therefore realized that you can be in public service and be not just a regular guy, but somebody who's really generous of spirit and heart, and get things done for our country.
Mm-hmm. And was it the same when you were working with him, like in the professional capacity, like in your job? Was he the same kind of cordial, or was he pretty intense? Or
he was intense enough to get the job done, but very respectful of people. And unlike maybe some administrations since then, I won't mention any, but you didn't see people leave the Bush administration, right? And you probably wanted some of us to leave, but he was, he was a good boss. He was fair, but he was tough. And, he expect you to be on time, and he expect you to be prepared. Not as much on time as George W. did. If you didn't get 5 minutes to a meeting 5 minutes early with George W. Bush, you were late. I learned that lesson my first week. Fred, you learned that lesson a few times. Portman, where have you been? But no, he was demanding, but in an appropriate way.
Mm-hmm. And did you have a chance to also work like with the Mosbacher family at all, either Bob or Rob or?
Well, Rob, who is with us today, we were talking about this earlier with some of the students, was at OPIC, and that's a Overseas Private Investment Corporation that helps companies in the United States to be able to compete globally. And he also worked with us on the new approach to that, which is the DFC, Development Finance Corporation, to combat, among other things, China Belt and Road. And so I've loved working with Rob. He did a great job at OPIC. I didn't really know his dad personally at all, but I admired him, and he was at the Commerce Department when I was at the the White House. So what a great family heritage. And I told Rob today, so great that he comes back so often here to keep this institute going and to support the Bush effort, the Bush School. So thank you.
Then you also had a number of other posts, like you said, where you said in the introduction, the George W. administration, right? And OMB is one, like maybe we could start a little bit with that. Because, during the George W. Bush administration, there was still concerns again about the debt, right? Which we hadn't really dealt with. And now it's only gotten, like you said, much, much worse, 35 trillion or something. So at the time, like what were some of the discussions or debates about the debt, and how did that help you connect with the public in helping them realize the importance?
Well, it's a great question, and I'm going to tell you something probably most people don't know. It's kind of been lost to history, but George W. Bush in 2007 submitted a budget to Congress that was a balanced budget over 5 years. Now, those of you who follow this closely, that's like amazing, because today people are talking about we can do a balanced budget maybe over 50 years or at least 25 years, because we're so far in debt. At the time, 2006, 2007, this was before the really collapse of the economy in 2008, 2009, admittedly, but the economy was doing well. He was keeping the spending under control. He frankly was vetoing, the Democrats controlled both the House and the Senate. He was vetoing their appropriations bills because they were too high. And then we were working out, continuing resolutions instead. But he was keeping the spending under control, and the economy was growing. And when I was OMB director, I felt it was important to offer a balanced budget to the American people so they could see it. And he had people whispering in his ear, no, you shouldn't do that, including some people who said deficits don't matter. I won't name who they were, but they were in the administration, as you may remember. George W. Bush said, no, you know what? We're going to do this. I'm going to back up OMB on this one. And so he did. So it was his budget. OMB just presents it. But it was brave of him to do it. And let's face it, since that time, it's been all downhill in the sense that we've had spending that way exceeds our revenues to the point that our children are now saddled with this huge debt, which is not just 100% of the GDP, but it is the highest level we've had really in our nation's history. Some say, well, you could count the day after, or the year after World War II, when we had a deficit that was 100% of the economy, but we didn't have Medicare, we didn't have all this overhang with the entitlement programs, and we quickly erased that because of the strong economy coming out of World War II. So it's not a good analogy. So really, this is it. We are in uncharted territory, and it's frightening to me because you could have a bond market that reacts pretty negatively pretty quickly. And for those of you who follow the bond market, it can happen fast. So I do think we need to be concerned about it. The rating agencies have been warning us, Fitch and Moody's, and saying, we're not taking care of our fiscal health. So it's a problem. The answer to it is not easy because these mandatory spending programs, mentioned earlier, entitlement programs, Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security in particular, are, the politically very difficult to address. Obviously, you would start by saying everybody who's currently retired and on these programs, or somebody who is close to retirement, would not be affected. But even so, it's a challenge. I will say the young people I met with earlier today, and some of the young people here tonight, probably don't believe they're ever going to get Social Security. Most don't. Who are, most 30-year-olds don't think they're ever going to get it. So there's a possibility of going to that next generation and saying, okay, going forward, again, it's going to take time. Let's begin to right this ship. We also have to work on the revenue side. And the best way to do it, of course, is to grow the economy. But, as we've seen with the Federal Reserve and what's going on in terms of our monetary policy, if you were to ask Jay Powell what his biggest concern is, it's not monetary policy, it's fiscal policy. It's the fact that it's gotten so out of whack that it may be hard for us to sell Treasury bonds. Already, China and Japan have pulled back quite a bit, and interest rates are going to remain high because people are going to require more and more interest rate hikes on federal treasuries to be able to take a chance on us if we don't get our act together. So this is a serious issue, and both candidates for president have made the same pledge, which is we're not going to touch Medicare, Medicaid, or Social Security. That's fine politically, you can say that, but at the end of the day, you got to figure out how to solve this problem. And if we don't, it's irresponsible to not just future generations, but again, you could have a crisis occur much more quickly. So I respect the fact that when George H.W. Bush, he took a political risk and he paid for it for all the right reasons when the debt was just minuscule. And I respect the fact that George W. Bush tried through his balanced budget. Again, what happened in 2008, 2009 got us started on these huge deficits and accumulated debt. But it's time for us to fix it. I've been promoting this idea of a fiscal commission. You may remember Simpson-Bowles. The problem with Simpson-Bowles was, among other things, that it was not statutory. In other words, it wasn't required to come to Congress for a vote up or down. It also had other problems, including the fact that President Obama opposed it when they came out with the recommendations, even though they were bipartisan. So it made it hard to pursue it. But I think you need a commission that's bipartisan, that has some outsiders on it and some members of Congress, key members of Congress, and then it has a statutory authorization that says you have to vote for it, yes or no. And Congress can choose to vote no, but it would put the American people in a position of understanding what the problem is better, because that should be one of the goals of a commission, is to educate people. And then second, propose some things that, again, it may take years to do it, but get us started on the right track and let Congress have an up or down vote. Mm-hmm. This has worked with the Base Closing Commission. Remember the BRAC Commission? It was up or down votes. People didn't want to lose their bases in their community, but the military was telling us we don't need all these bases anymore, and so we did this BRAC process, up or down vote, and it worked. So I'm hopeful that whoever gets elected, and whether the Congress is Republican or Democrat, that people will take another look at this. There's a legislative vehicle both in the House and Senate to do just this.
But it might also help if the voters themselves were more educated and they were more proactive and thought that the debt really mattered, right? I mean, when people are saying the debt doesn't matter, it's hard to get people in Congress excited about it, right? So
it is. I mean, I think you have to raise the very real possibility, in my view, that interest rates would remain high and maybe go up even further if you don't do something, so people feel like there's some impact. Because with rates so low, one, people weren't feeling it, but two, there were economists saying, and I think they regret it now, well, it's fine to borrow more. Let's just keep borrowing because our interest rates are so low.
Huh? I wasn't one of those.
No, not you.
I wasn't one of them.
But you know what I'm talking about.
I know exactly what you're talking about.
And some of them have since said, we weren't right about that.
Yeah.
But when you have interest rates at 1%, they're thinking, well, it's great. Let's just borrow the money for social programs. Well, here we are.
Right.
Interest rates tend to go up and down. They went up, and we found ourselves now paying more on interest on the debt than we're paying for our entire U.S. military. Think about that. This year we will pay more on interest on the debt than the entire budget of the U.S. military. And Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff General said, I don't know, a dozen years ago probably now, maybe a decade ago, when asked what the biggest danger is facing our country from a national security perspective, the debt. And
the Chinese are holding a lot. I mean, that also puts us in a compromised position in an economic sense.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Although they're pulling back some because
right.
they see the risk.
I got to tell you, I can feel economics is a dismal science, and I can feel the mood in the room shift. So can we just change direction a little bit? Let's just talk about your legislative success, right? Because that's really a huge success story, your time in both the House and the Senate. I mean, 220 bills. I mean, that's incredible success. I mean, to what do you attribute a lot of your ability to be so productive?
Well, I mean, it's not that hard. I mean, in your family and your businesses, I mean, you figure it out, right? You figured out how to get to yes. And the problem with Congress, in my view, is that increasingly Congress has had a hard time finding common ground because the incentives are all working in the wrong way. Now, there are members who are an exception to that, and you've got a bunch of them in Texas. And they're my former colleagues. John Cornyn is one, as an example. Mike McCall. There are members who really try to focus on answers. The reason I started this thing at the University of Cincinnati, my hometown university, it's called the Portman Center for Policy Solutions, is to me it's not just about bipartisanship, as nice as it is, or civility, which is great, George Bush, civility and so on. It's about the fact that we're not addressing our major problems in this country because of it. And if you can't find common ground on something like immigration, the border, probably the poster child of this, what happens? Well, you do nothing, in this case for decades, not since the mid-1980s have we addressed immigration. And look at the disaster on the border today. and the totally nonsensical immigration policy generally we have. Why? Because it's not in either side's advantage to do that. It's much better to complain about it and blame the other side. And we have what some people call, more and more theatrics in Congress, or performative politics is something people are talking about. In other words, people get elected to Congress, and they're performative, meaning that they're on MSNBC or they're on Fox or they're online, and they're having good success at raising money for themselves, and they can get reelected. And because our primary systems tend to be very, very narrow now, very few people are voting in primaries relative to the population of the district or the state. And those people are not looking to solve problems. They are looking to make a name for themselves, right? And so as a country, we need to address that, in my view. And one way to do it is to hold up people who are bipartisan, who are getting things done, who are worried about the families of the people they represent. That's pretty simple. Another is for all of us to vote in primaries. How many of you voted in the Democrat or Republican primary this last election? All right, wow. Forget it, put your hand. This is a very well-educated group and very active, and you're self-selected by being here to listen to this garble. But if we were to ask that question seriously on the streets of College Station or Houston, most people wouldn't raise their hands because they aren't voting in primaries. There's a statistic out there which is mathematically true, I suppose, because they've done the analysis, which is that 8% of the voters in America are electing over 80% of the members of Congress. And you think about it, most Republicans in Ohio don't even vote in the Republican primary. So you start off with, you've got, in Ohio, where, like many states, independence is actually the plurality. So you have maybe 35% Republicans, 30% Democrats, and the rest independents. But so less than half of the Republicans are voting in the primary, and they're only 35% of the electorate. So you end up with a relatively small number of people electing folks if they're in a red district or a blue district or a red state or a blue state. And increasingly, that's what we have in our country. States are pretty well established. There aren't, people say there are 6 or 7 swing states out of 50. You think about it. And districts here in Texas and in Ohio are increasingly red or blue. So I think, we need to look at that as a country and say, how do we get more people engaged and involved in primaries so that we end up with a representative or a senator that better represents the district or the state? So that's something that we're working on. It's not easy. There's some people out there that say you have to go to an open primary system like California has. Maybe. They usually end up with 2 Democrats running against each other in California now. There's an exception this year. There is a Republican running for the Senate who got into the finals. But usually it's, California is so blue. But that's one way to do it, is to open it up more, because you end up having sometimes then the more moderate, or it's not even about moderate or conservative or liberal to me. The candidate that wants to solve problems might have a chance there to pull in enough Democrat votes and then say all the Republican votes in California, so you get a more middle-of-the-road kind of a person. Does that make sense? So it might work. We're analyzing that and some other ideas. There's ranked choice voting you may have heard of, which is being done in states like Maine and Alaska. A little different system. It's hard to explain. I think a lot of American people who are already suspicious about our electoral system aren't going to be real excited about that. But it's, you have to rank your choices, and you winnow it out. So the second round, you could have the 4 people running, and then you have to choose. If the first place finisher doesn't get enough votes, and you go to the second place finisher. That was Lisa Murkowski. That was Susan Collins. So it worked in those cases, in my view. Those are great members who really focus on getting things done. But bottom line is, Raymond, I think it comes back to us as citizens. Are we going to step up and get more engaged in politics like the people in this room are? Mm-hmm. And are we going to help to, therefore, forge a better future? One little aside, it's not just about primaries. It's not just about gerrymandering districts. And by the way, gerrymandering is a problem, but this is controversial for me to say, I suppose, but I don't think it's as big a problem as some do, because the bigger problem is that we're divided as a country. So in Ohio, we have some districts that look sort of gerrymandered, but honestly, it's because geographically we've kind of divided ourselves. So in the urban areas of Ohio or Texas, it's all blue. In the rural areas, it's all red. Didn't used to be that way. So when you draw a line that protects political jurisdictions like a city, or a rural area, you're going to tend to draw lines that are pretty red and pretty blue. So I don't think that's going to solve the problem to deal with gerrymandering unless we solve this bigger problem of let's all get engaged and involved in primaries and elect somebody, again, who better represents the district. Another just little aside, then I'll be quiet, I'm sorry, is fundraising. And to those of you who've been involved in politics over the years, I see some faces in the crowd who have been very generous in terms of political contributions. And thank you, Rob, and thank you others. But probably in this election, most of the money raised in politics will not come from major donors. Most of the money will come from very small denominations, often repeated many times, because that's the new online fundraising phenomenon. So someone, whether it's Ted Cruz as a Republican, or whether it's someone like Sherrod Brown, who's a Democrat in Ohio, they're raising millions and millions, sometimes tens of millions of dollars a quarter from online fundraising. And so, not that they don't care what the major donors think anymore, but they're not as focused on that. They're more focused on putting out very partisan messages that gets people excited enough to give 20 bucks, and then 30 bucks again, and then 35 bucks, and then 20 bucks again, and that adds up. So these folks may live in California, they may live in New York if they're Democrats, they may live in Texas if they're Republicans, but they're supporting candidates all over the country. So the Democrats are really good at it. The Republicans aren't quite as good at it yet, but they're getting there. And when I thought about running for office this last time, I chose not to, but when I thought about it, my consultants came to me and said, Rob, your emails are terrible. If you're going to raise money, you got to really go after it. You want to talk about policy in your emails to prospective donors? That's a yawn. It's like, you got to go after the Democrats. They're, devil incarnate. You got to lay it out there that the world is going to end unless you give me 25 bucks because of these terrible people. I thought, I'm not going to go there. And but that's a reality. It's just, there's centrifugal forces in our system right now. One is fundraising that are pushing people to the outside. Because when that member of Congress gets to the House, who has just castigated the Speaker of the House constantly as a Democrat, and walks up to meet Mike Johnson, what does Mike Johnson think? This person called me all sorts of names and, said things that weren't true about me. And when the Republican, goes up to Hakeem Jeffries and says, nice to meet you, Mr. Jeffries, whether he's Speaker or Majority Leader, I don't know what it's going to be. But, it creates a sense of partisanship even before you get started, because you're being pushed to the extreme to raise money. So, that's my theory. I don't know if it's true or not, but a lot of major donors, are more in the middle. Let's just be honest, and are looking for solutions. And if they're being pushed out of the system more, and it's more about small denomination fundraising, which in theory is a good thing, but in practice, I think is pushing us to the outside. The other reality is that the parties have much less power than they used to. And everybody thought that the McCain-Feingold reforms were great. I didn't at the time, and I still don't, because I think it left the political parties with less power. So there's all these soft money groups and dark money groups that are out there, but they're not the RNC or the DNC. And they tend not to have, I think, the interests of the parties as much in mind, but more often an extreme agenda. And that's my view anyway. I think I'd rather give the parties, the organizers of democracy in this country have always been the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, and it works pretty well. So not perfect, and no fundraising is perfect. But I think that's one thing we should be looking at as well, to try to get back to a system where we can find common ground again. Whether you come from the right, whether you're MAGA Republican, or whether you're Bernie Sanders progressive, it really doesn't matter to me. I think even those people, if they come to Congress with the attitude of finding the middle ground, wherever it can be found, that would be better for our country. On the debt and deficit, certainly on the border and immigration, healthcare. Think of the issue that's not being addressed now, and how it could be addressed if we could provide incentives to find that common ground.
So one of the things I heard you suggest just minutes ago about a way we can do that is to really support those people who have found common ground and have been successful. So tell us about some of your successes in the House and the Senate. Like, of these 220 bills, like, what were you most proud of? Like, what do you think was the things you'll remember the most?
Yeah, in our little center, we're doing what you do at the Bush Center, and I appreciate you doing it, which is you hold up people who have been bipartisan. We're doing an award, one Democrat, one Republican, and I do think there's some role there. There's a Lugar survey named after former Senator Dick Lugar that, has this bipartisan index. I'm not saying it's perfect, but that was good. I used to brag about it. I was usually in the top 2 or 3 among Republicans. And, I think most people want members of Congress to get stuff done. They aren't necessarily represented by the primary voter, who may have a different view of it, which is fight, 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 and forget about getting stuff done. But most people, based on the surveys, and there's a recent poll about, do you support members of Congress who compromise to get things done, or members of Congress who stick by their principles? And I thought, well, principles is going to win. Everybody loves principles. No, 74% of the voters said we want someone who's going to get stuff done. So, I mean, I'm proud of my record, but it's not that hard. It's like I didn't do anything that special. It's just that there weren't other people doing it too much. So you mentioned the infrastructure bill. That was Kirsten Sinema, who's from Arizona, and myself. And we got an infrastructure bill from President Biden that was not really infrastructure. It was mostly, new spending on social programs that were not infrastructure. They called it social infrastructure. And we're talking about roads and bridges. So we said, okay, let's take out all that stuff, take out all the big new tax increases, let's figure out a way to pay for what we have left, and let's do an infrastructure bill. And that's the bill that ended up being done. It took about a year to do it, but it was totally from the inside out. It was Republicans and Democrats working together, starting with 2 of us, and then 5 and 5, then 10 and 10, then 11 and 11, 12 and 12. And we got enough Republicans and Democrats in the Senate to support it. We ended up with 69 votes for it. And by the way, the members who didn't vote for it, which would be, 31 of them, many of them are going to the ribbon cuttings for this infrastructure bill. Great bridge, yeah, but anyway, that's the way it goes. But that I'm proud of. I'm proud of the work I've done on taxes over the years. It's a real boring topic, as you know, Mr. Economist, but as Raymond will tell you, we had a situation where our tax code was so bad from an international perspective that we had countries actually taking our jobs and our investments away, and U.S. companies inverting, meaning they were becoming foreign companies. And this was a real problem in Ohio. We had some big companies become foreign entities because of our tax law. It was so bad. We had the highest corporate tax rate in the industrialized world, so the rate itself was too high. Plus, we taxed on a basis that was worldwide rather than territorial, meaning if you made money overseas, you had to pay for it in the United States. Other countries weren't doing that. None of the OECD countries, the developed countries, were doing that. And so we were losing jobs, investment. Big companies like Apple were putting their investments overseas, pharmaceutical companies. So that's part of the 2017 tax bill that gets not enough attention, in my view. It's complicated, but bottom line is we changed the system not just to lower the rate, to put it about in the middle. It's actually not low relative to these other countries. It's about in the middle, as compared to what some Democrats might tell you, of the other OECD countries. And we changed that system so that you didn't have this worldwide tax system that was unfair to U.S. companies and U.S. workers. What happened? All the inversion stopped. Not a single inversion since then. Not a single company's gone overseas. Companies brought back literally trillions of dollars to the United States, including Apple. And they brought their IP, a lot of them, back to the United States because we protected intellectual property. So this notion that this was all tax cuts for the rich or tax cuts for big corporations, it was tax cuts for workers because they're getting the benefit of it, and consumers, because you raise corporate tax rates, it's going to get passed along to consumers. And so I'm proud of that. And we don't talk about it as much as we should, in my view. But when you look at pre-pandemic, what our economy was doing, because of the 2017 tax bill largely, somewhat on regulatory reform too, we were hitting on all cylinders. We had, over 3% wage growth for 18 months in a row, which was, at that time, well above inflation. We had the lowest unemployment rate ever for certain groups of Americans, including blacks, Hispanics. And we had an opportunity economy. And I think a lot of that had to do with that tax reform, and a lot of it had to do with the international side, where people were bringing back investment and therefore jobs, and people were working for these companies, and that helped to improve the economy. I also did a lot of work on the opioid crisis. I can't tell you that we had the success I'd like. There's a new data point out today that the opioid overdose rate is down by over 10% this year. I hope that's true. We're finally starting to get control of this, but I did a lot of legislation on how do you stop the poison from coming in, but also how do you deal with treatment and longer-term recovery and prevention. Because if you don't deal with those things, my feeling is you're not, in the end, going to be able to get at this issue. Because even if people can't get the fentanyl coming across the southern border, or before that it was coming in, from China directly to our post offices, they'll find it some other way if you don't deal with the underlying addiction problem. So I think it's both a supply side problem and a demand problem. And I can't tell you that we made huge progress, but we had a reduction that was pretty substantial in Ohio and other states after passing that legislation. Then COVID hit and went back up again. Now it seems to be going back down again, I hope. Let's hope and pray that it will. But I did a lot of work in that area and probably met about 1,000 addicts or recovering addicts in Ohio in that process, because I went out and talked to a lot of people, and that alone is just a very powerful experience. And I still stay in touch with some of those people. So there's everything from economic stuff and infrastructure to things like the opioid crisis and human trafficking. Wrote some legislation that was historic on human trafficking because no one had ever pierced Section 230 to hold platforms. These are platforms that were online selling underage girls, and they were doing so with impunity because of a part of our law called Section 230. It was written back in the 1990s. We wanted to encourage the internet that allows these platforms not to be held liable for something that happens. And we were able to prove that this was something that was being done deliberately by one website in particular that had about 75% of the trafficking. That website is no longer in existence, and those individuals are now in prison. And so I was proud of our work there too.
That's excellent.
Yeah.
Well, the Mosbacher Institute is the Institute for Trade, Economics, and Public Policy, and you are also the U.S. Trade Representative. Yeah. And I'd love to hear your vision of America's role in the world today, in a world where both parties are increasingly isolationist, yeah, and how you see our role and what the consequences of both the current position is and a better hope for the future.
Yeah. Boy, we had a big shift in our country. We had a Democrat-Republican consensus really going back to World War II saying we should engage with the rest of the world and try to reduce barriers. Part of that was also a commitment to fairness. And one thing that happened during this period is that one country in particular, China, engaged heavily in trade and didn't do so in a fair manner. In other words, they subsidized and they sold material at below their cost, which is called dumping. And so that makes it complicated. But to me, instead of pulling back as we have done, we ought to engage. And we ought to engage on the basis of fairness. So to summarize my view of it, anyway, Trump administration did some good things. USMCA, which was the successor to NAFTA, which is a huge agreement with our two biggest trading partners, Mexico and Canada. They also completed agreements with Japan and with the UK that got part of the way there, not quite a full trade agreement. But they were engaged and involved. They also, though, put tariffs in place under what's called Section 232, which is, Section 232, which is a national security provision where the president can say for national security reasons we're going to slap tariffs. That was the aluminum and steel tariffs, including on some of our allies like Canada and Europe. To me, that wasn't right because it wasn't based on fairness. They weren't doing anything wrong. If a country cheats, which China has done, then I think it is appropriate to put tariffs in place that are directly focused on that topic and reciprocal. And that's what the Section 301 tariffs were on China. So bottom line is, I think they did some things that were good and some things that went too far. And then the Biden administration came in, and apparently during the campaign there was a commitment made that we weren't going to do any more trade agreements. And this particularly to the labor unions who were concerned about it. By the way, those same labor unions, many of those had supported USMCA. So I thought we had a nice template there where they were generally in agreement, understood that there can be beneficial trade when it's fair, a level playing field. But the administration for 3.5 years has done 0 trade agreements. And the reality is that American farmers and American ranchers and American workers, American service providers have been disadvantaged because other countries are making agreements. As you know, China's been very aggressive at doing trade agreements. They're weak agreements. They're not the kind that we would do. They're not as deep and as lasting, but they're agreements. And they're doing it with African countries, Latin American countries, Asian countries. The Europeans have been active. The UK has been very active in doing agreements. And in effect, we're getting shut out of some of the benefits of those agreements because they get lower tariffs and we don't. So I'm very discouraged by the fact that the administration has not been willing to engage. And I hope that if it's President Harris, that she will change that policy. And if it's President Trump, that he will get back to doing agreements again that make sense, understanding that when a country cheats, you know, we have the right to take actions to increase the tariffs, which is supposed to compensate for their unfairness, either their subsidy or their dumping. And we have laws to do that. So my view is we need to get back to what I call balanced trade, where it's not unfettered free trade. We understand that's not fair. Workers don't like that for good reason, because they feel like they're doing their best and yet the other side has an advantage. But we need to have a way to stipulate what is fair and what's not. And it's not easy, but you can do that. And then get back in the game. Because I really worry, and I don't know, Raymond, you and I haven't talked about this issue of the U.S. getting sort of knocked out of the trade world, but it really has hurt us economically, and I think even diplomatically. I think people want America to be engaged and involved. Most countries do, the free world does. And they're worried that we're pulling back and are not as engaged, which goes to a broader issue about foreign policy, but even on the economic side. Because when the U.S. does an agreement with a country, you know, we require reforms on things like labor rights, environmental conditions, and so on. So it helps to reform those countries and make them stronger free market partners. And that's been missing.
Yeah, actually, I did a couple papers, a couple studies that got published that shows that including those labor provisions don't discourage trade at all, and they actually end up lifting the standards in the other countries exactly as they're designed to do. So I agree with you 100%. Yeah. And I think you've already pointed out that China's involved in Africa, Latin America, and other parts of the world that we are not, and that's something that's putting us far behind.
We get left out. Would you like to be U.S. Trade Representative?
Is it a good job?
Like to, yeah, it's great. I'd like to nominate you.
I like working at the Bush School.
Okay. Mark, you looked a little nervous when I said that. Yeah. Just kidding, Dean.
I know that we're almost coming up on time. There's two other things I did want to ask you about, and one is more of a simple one. Is just, I don't think people realize the mission statement you had when you were in the Senate. I mean, you had a very particular, different kind of mission statement, didn't you, about bipartisanship specifically?
Well, I mean, what I told my staff is we're all in this, you know, great green earth only for a short period of time, and we're certainly only in the Senate or the House for a short period of time, and make the most of it. We probably overextended ourselves sometimes. Fred might say that. But the idea was just to get as much done as you can to help the people you're representing. And for me, it was Ohio, but also our country. And so that was our mission statement was, you know, take chances. Get to know the other side, you know, show respect, and it's not that hard. Again, this is simple. I memean, you do it every day in your lives. Think about your family life where you don't always get your way, but you work something out. Is your wife here, sir? That was a guffaw. And then in your business lives, you know, I mean, you have to figure out how to come to yes. I'm looking at the president of Texas A&M thinking probably he doesn't agree with the faculty on everything, but they have to find a way to come together, right? And Dean Sherman, probably the same thing. Okay, yes. Yeah, forget it. He agrees on everything.
So far.
Yeah, A&M is a little bit of a different university than some, and I applaud you for that. You guys managed to work together well and, you know, allow the First Amendment rights to be exercised, but don't let it get out of control. I appreciate that.
We did have one question from the audience. There's a couple that came in, but we just probably have time for one. And one was, what were some of the lessons that you learned, like maybe from a misstep or learned from experience where things didn't go quite as you thought, and you took away a lesson that made you more productive later?
You know, one that I was thinking about the other day is when I first got to the House, and I did this in the Senate too, you get really ticked off at people sometimes because, you know, they might commit they're going to do something with you on legislation, and then in the end of the day they turn on you This happened to be on a very important project in Cincinnati, Ohio, an Underground Railroad. We were trying to do a national thing, and my Democrat colleagues turned on me for political reasons, because there was a political thing with another member. They didn't want to help. I was so mad. It was just wrong. And what I learned is the first lesson in politics, which is never burn a bridge. Because those same members, 2 years later, I had to rely on to get something else done. And so you have to kind of hold your anger within and continue to work with people. And this is true in life generally, but certainly true in terms of the legislature, because your enemy one day is going to be your friend the next. And you never know when that's going to happen. And your goal is not, to settle scores. Your goal is to get something done for the people you represent. Again, that's the mission statement we talked about. What's the best thing we can do? So you have to be willing to kind of do what George Bush did sometimes. George H.W. Bush was famous for it. He was a humble guy, and he restrained himself sometimes. His greatest restraint, by the way, was in the Cold War, when instead of dancing on the Berlin Wall, he held back and allowed the Europeans and others to take a lead. And sure enough, Gorbachev, who was his enemy at one point, and they didn't like each other much at one point, I'm told, ended up coming to Texas to visit George H.W. Bush. He was there at Bush at 80. So your friend one day will be really needed, and maybe your enemy today, but you need to not burn that bridge. That's one lesson I learned the hard way.
That's great. Our mission, obviously, is to carry out the wishes of George H.W. Bush and educate the next generation of students. Do you have any advice for the students who are here tonight in terms of pursuing a career in public service?
Noble profession, George Bush, Well, look, it's not for everybody to run for office, and I don't advise that for everybody. It's tough these days. Your family life will be compromised by it. It's hard. So I don't try to sugarcoat it. I think it's hard. But I also think to have the ability to serve your fellow American is the greatest honor of all. I mean, it's just, and I miss it. I really miss public service. I don't miss everything about Washington, but I miss public service. So, whether you want to be in elective office or whether you want to be in a, support role, working for the state government or the federal government or the legislature, I hope you'll pursue it. I met a lot of master's degree students today, international affairs. Sounds like most of them are interested in public service. And by the way, the record of this school and working with the Institute and others is phenomenal. I mean, I don't think there is another school in the country that places the same percentage of your students in public service. And there are lots of public service-oriented schools around the country and programs. But Dean, I don't believe there's another one in the country that can hold a candle to what I've heard about your placement. So whatever you're doing, keep it up. We need good people in public service. And we need people who are doing it for the right reasons. Not performative art, but because they really do want to make a difference in the lives of their neighbors. And so go for it. Again, elected office isn't for everybody. I understand that, but there are lots of ways that you can serve. And I hope some of you will choose to do that.
I want to thank you all so much for joining us today. You make these events so special, and especially join me in thanking our special guests.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Appreciate it.